the Seder of the Negoyim, with Tzaras, so the Torah first tells us about Nigei Adam, about Tzaras that comes on a person. Then the Pasuk is Mamshech, and it tells us about Nigei Begodim. The person gets a nega on a beged, on a piece of clothing, and then the Torah tells us about Nigei Batim. The nega comes on a house. So we know, Chazal say, that the Rebbeinu Shalom starts off, the Rebbeinu Shalom gives a person, if a person has to get a nega, he starts off giving it to him on his house. The person doesn't get the message, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, listen, you didn't get the message when we gave it to you on the house, we give it to you on the clothing. The person doesn't get the message, he gets it on his clothing, so the Rebbeinu Shalom goes and ultimately gives him the nega on himself. So Rabbeinu Bechaya says, the L'chira, it's an interesting thing, the Seder is not the right Seder, because in the Pasuk it's just the opposite. The Torah starts off with the Nigei Adam, it starts at first on the person, then the Torah is Mamshech, and the Torah talks about the Nega that comes on the Beged, and then the Torah tells us ultimately it's going to be on the bias, which is in our Parsha. Dr. Rabbeinu Bechaya, that the reason why is like this. Why did the Pasuk say it not in the right Seder? Ki izkiru tchila tzaras haguf v'achar kach tzaras habegodim v'achar tzaras habatim lefi she'atayro kol deracheh darkei noyam. The Torah, all the ways are beautiful. V'chol nesiveseh shalom kadesh lo yeh seder mesudah b'peronius heilich v'gadol. Since we didn't want to tell us about Peronius, something terrible that keeps on getting worse and worse, so therefore the Torah tells us the opposite. The Torah the Torah says it gets less and less, but really ultimately it's the opposite Seder and it gets worse and worse. We don't want to say that it keeps on, things keep on getting worse. So therefore the Seder in the Torah was first Adam, then Beged, then Gufay. So it's a peldik azach, because we all know, if you go into the parsha of the Teichecha, it's very clear psukim, the Torah starts off, the Torah says if you don't do the Averis, if you don't keep the mitzvahs and a person does Averis, he's going to get such a einish. And the Torah goes right there and it says if you don't listen and you keep on not doing the mitzvahs and a person does Averis, it says and I'm going to get worse and worse. So it's klora psukim, you have klora psukim that the Torah defines things getting worse and worse. So what does Rabbeinu Chaim mean? The Rachel Darkei Noyam that we told, we don't want to say, we told very, very, we don't want to be so clear and we go the opposite direction. So the Torah is Pasha. What's the chiluk? The chiluk is that when the Torah is telling us the Einshim a person Chas v'Shalom gets when he does Averis, the Torah clearly defines exactly what happens. So the Torah, we have a whole parsha of Teichecha. The Torah starts off that it starts off small. A person doesn't do tshuva. That person keeps on doing chatom. It gets worse and worse. Tzaras is not a einish. Fakert. The ik of tzaras is not a einish. Tzaras comes on what Chazal say. Tzaras comes on lashon hara. Lashon hara is mavur in Chazal that if a person doesn't do tshuva, not only does he lose this world, he loses his world in olam haba. But Mitzvah and Chazal goes Keseda. It could be everlasting. There were people that lost the Ilam Habel and Netzach and Tzachim just because of Lashon Hara. So the idea of Tzaras is more a subtle message the Rabbeinu Shalom was giving a person, do tshuva. And therefore, over here, since we're not clearly defining the Einish, we're not saying this is the Einish, so therefore Rabbeinu Bechaya says that when it comes to something, just giving a subtle message, the Torah doesn't want to say that it gets worse and worse, so we start off with the worst and we make it better. What happens that Benegeya Tzaras, Benegeya Lashon Hara, which is such a every Aver, the Torah gives a Einish and L'chaim U'Shalom. Over here, you see the Torah keeps on giving messages and messages and messages. The Rebbeinu Shalom gives messages to a person that he has to do tshuva. If he doesn't do tshuva, we give him another subtle message. What happens when Benegeya Tzaras? that you find it so unique that the Torah, that the Rebbeinu Shalom keeps on giving the word.
Zum Beispiel wie der Eibischte stellt sich weg nach Loschen Teuf. Zum Beispiel sagen, ich trage Loschen Heuer. Zuerst kommt doch auf Loschen Heuer. So, der Eibischte stellt sich weg nach Loschen Teuf.
I hear.
Aber warum ist sehr lang bei mir?
No, I hear.
Morgan,
I hear.
Loschen is not the tongue. The velka from the tongue, not lotion.
Oh, so we want to say this. Very good. I want to say a little bit on your mahalach. I want to say this. You say they fakert, punk fakert. Benegay Lashon Hara, because it's so chamor, then be'etzem it's not shaykh b'chlal ta'inish. The inish is olam haba, and that's a chatzach, and the person has to tshuva. But there's a murder kazach. You find the Meshech Chochmah writes in last week's parish, he says a murder kazach. Something Meshech Chochmah that you find usually a kohen is avodah. The kohen of avodah is in the mikdash. There's only two places in the Torah that you find that a kohen is unique and he has a specific job out of the Beis HaMikdash. One is para aduma, and one is negoyim. It says a person has a nega, he has to bring it to the kohen. Right? Zok the Meshech Chochmah. Of course, we don't understand why. Just like negoyim is a choik, just like para aduma is a choik. This, that the person has to bring a nega to the kohen, and the kohen is the one that's matama and matayir it, the sister Torah. But Zok the Meshech Chochmah, he thinks he knows what the pshat is. Why? Zok there, it's mavur in the Rishonim, and I think it's really based on a famous Havavos. A famous Chavos Havavos. Chavos Havavos says, "By Yaakov Avinu tells the Rebbeinu Shalom, Katointi mikol hachasadim umikol haemes asher asisas avdecha." So Pashtus, we learned why is Yaakov Avinu saying Katointi? Why was he worried about it? On Chazal, Shem Yigram Achet, that he doesn't have enough schusim. Zok the Chavos Havavos Ameri Kazach. We find that the closer a person is to the Rebbeinu Shalom, there's more mechayev and avodas Hashem. You find goyim have shiva mitzvahs b'nei nech because they don't have, the Rebbeinu Shalom is not so much in contact with them. Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom is much more in contact with them. We have 613 mitzvahs. Within Klal Yisrael, there's Leviim. Leviim, there's Trumas and Meisters because the Rebbeinu Shalom is more in contact with them. They have their unique mitzvahs. And then you have the Kohanim that they have even more mitzvahs because the Rebbeinu Shalom is much closer to them. So the closer the Rebbeinu Shalom is to a person, the more mechayev there is to do a better avodas Hashem. And Memelo Yaakov Avinu says, "Katointi mikol hachasadim," because the Rebbeinu Shalom was doing unique chesed with Yaakov Avinu. He was looking after him all the time. Such a connection that Yaakov Avinu is mechayev that I should do more avodas Hashem to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And he was worried that he didn't do that avodas Hashem with such a closeness would be mechayev to do. Zok the Meshech Chochmah, that when you have a nega zavur in the Rishonim, that it was somewhat of a pandemic, it was a disease. Tomei Yikra, Badei Yeshev, he has to go chutz l'machaneh, right? We're keeping this guy in quarantine. Now imagine we told the kohen, you go into quarantine, you meet this guy and tell him that it's Tomei, tell him that it's Tar. The kohen, you're putting him into sakonas nefashos, you're making him walking into a hospital in the middle of COVID and visiting a person. What's going on? What are we doing to the kohen? Zok the Meshech Chochmah, since it says la'avdiloi by the Kohanim, the kodesh hakadoshim, by the kodesh that the Kohanim are movdal, they're close to the Rebbeinu Shalom because they have that connection to the Rebbeinu Shalom that protects them and from getting this terrible disease that this guy with Tzaras has. And Memelo, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, you go and visit him, you don't have to be concerned about catching this disease. You could go and tell him Tameh, you could go and tell him Tar. And therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom said, Kohanim should be in charge of defining Tar and Tameh. So the Chayr come to case like this, that the guy that does Lashon Hara, the guy that says Lashon Hara, who's saying Lashon Hara? We're not talking about a guy that's going to say that this guy's a Meshuggah. Who says stand in Lashon Hara? The guy that feels he's right, some guy ba'aveled him, some guy did something terribly wrong, and he's saying over, and he feels this guy should be buried. And fakir, he sometimes thinks it's a mitzvah. You know what they say by Koirach, right? The Koirach v'Hadassah, they had that the 250s that came, the mon used to come. right? Imagine the next day they were all fighting a Moshe Rabbeinu. They woke up and the man is 5 miles away from their house, right? Because the closer they weren't to being a tzaddik, the closer it was. They were fighting a Moshe Rabbeinu. So of course the next morning the man was 5 miles away. So what they think? Sagen the Musa that they thought that they should have been fighting harder. The Rebbeinu Shalom was telling them they didn't fight hard enough. So who's saying Lashon Hara? The guy that thinks he's totally right. And be say that he can't see a person that's involved and has some sheikhat to himself, can't see beyond himself. There's no way for him to get clarity. Zok the Rebbeinu Shalom, it's pointless for us. He has a tremendous avera and there's nothing for us to do to fix him. You know how we're going to fix him? We're going to give him a din that he has to go chutz l'machane. He has to meet up with a kohen. The kohanim are muvdal and they're tahirim and they're close to the Rebbeinu Shalom. The ashpah that he'll have with meeting the kohen from that interaction, that ashpah would be able to change him and give him some clarity and see and define he did something wrong. And it starts out with a subtle message, and if he doesn't get it with his house, he'll get it with his begadim. If he doesn't get it with his begadim, over there finally he'll get it by giving him a nega on himself. He has a nega on himself, he's going to have interaction with those that are close to the Rebbeinu Shalom. That ashpah was the ashpah that's necessary for him in order to be able to give him the ability to see clearly where he stands and to be able to do tshuva. And when Mela Dafka by Tzaras that comes to Lashon Hara, which is such a very chamura, we say that the Rebbeinu Shalom didn't give him an einish. The einish is too great. How does he do tshuva? How does he have the capability of doing tshuva? The Rebbeinu Shalom did a chesed with him and let him meet the kohen and let him define it. The closer that a person is to someone that has Avodas Hashem, the closer that a person is to those that are connected to the Rebbeinu Shalom, that ashpah gives clarity and that gives him the capability of doing the emes Avodas Hashem. I had a Rebbe, his name was the Vardan, the Rebbe, he's today, he was a Kaddish Vitar, he came out of Auschwitz, none of you know him, and what? He wasn't a kohen, but you connected with him right away. Every person had that connection with him, that you were able to see what a Kaddish Vitar is, and he gave you clarity. Go ahead.